All right, hello. So again, I'm doing this as a birthday project, not for my birthday, but for Leo's birthday. Leo is a friend of mine, was a friend of mine, who died a few years ago. He got a pronouncement from his doctor that he had 3 months to live. So I went out to go be with him for the end of his life. He ended up living another 5 years after he had 3 months to live. I think about a year after he thought he was going to die, I was back in New York City, and he started writing his memoirs. He was always somebody who loved telling stories, so it was incredibly exciting to me that he started writing his memoirs. And he'd send me little chapters as he wrote them, and he got a good chunk of them written. However, he lost his computer in the process, and that interrupted his flow. And when he did find his computer many weeks later, somebody found it and gave it back to him. He never continued writing again. So I'm going to start right now just reading his memoirs. It's, as I said, 25,000 words. This is going to start with, and this is from, I think he wrote this in 2011. So this is, everybody can hear, is anybody who's on can hear me? Great. So we're going to start with this little introduction he wrote to me. He said, in the 11 years that we've known each other, I've taken great pleasure entertaining, trying to at least, you with stories of my past. Some stories were slightly embroidered tales of my infancy and childhood, and others began when I was your age. Whenever possible, I'd throw in a few humorous lines or funny comments to sum up the situation. Some were more serious, aimed at giving you a glimpse into the world in which I was molded, and the life and times that made me the person you came to know, and if I dare say, love. When you surprised me with the book of photos that you had made from the pictures we found while sorting out things here, and the photos my brother James had and you digitized, it got me wandering back in time as I looked at that precious gift. Each photo had a story behind it, and as I pondered them, the story started to unwind like a ball of yarn, one tale leading to the next. So I set my mind to putting my story into writing to give you, and anyone else who might chance to read it, an insight into just who Leo was, while I have this gift of this borrowed time. The only way I could tell these, sometimes intimate, even somewhat painful, memories of my life was to write them to you personally, with the same rare candor that we have always enjoyed between us. Whoever else may happen to share in these tales after my life has come to the last line of the final chapter will only comprehend them fully if they understand that it was written from my heart to you, Dominic. Love, Leo. I, Leo, 1947 to 1950. I, Leo, was born one of 3 only children. Don't try to make sense of that statement. It will become apparent as you read on, or not. In 1947, Brooklyn, my father Joseph and my mother Marie were old enough to be grandparents at my unexpected arrival in this world. It was the first marriage for both of them on the 25th of December, 1943, even though they had known each other for almost a decade. I understand the first pregnancy was a miscarriage, and so when my older brother Paul was born in 1945, he was considered a miracle. And quite remarkable he was, engaging, sociable, and speaking in full sentences before he was 1 year old. He was everything they could have wanted, and with the war over that same year and my father working for the Long Island Railroad, they had built their little nest in a rented upstairs apartment in the Richmond Hill neighborhood of Queens, one of the boroughs of New York City. Quite unexpectedly, I came along 27 months after Paul was born, and that air of unexpectancy hung over me from day one. Then 14 months later, my brother James was born. By then, nothing was a surprise. He was adorable, blonde curly hair, blue eyes, dimples, and a face that could have been on a jar of baby food. Not me. I was taciturn, with a slight air of disdain, but on the rare occasions when I was minded to smile, it was like a sunny day in Seattle. I also had oversized gray-blue eyes that I could flash for good or ill as suited my whim. My earliest recollection was being put in a sandbox to play with other children, and one of the others filling my diaper with sand. From this I learned to shun having anything to do with peers, as one would avoid doing jail time. My other vague memory was being taken to Mass at Our Lady of the Cenacle Church in Richmond Hill by my mother, who was carrying baby James in one arm and holding on to me with the other. Paul would have been perfectly behaved at her side. When the collection was being taken, she had to let go of me so she could rummage around her pocketbook to come up with her quarter for the offering. And looking down, I was gone. I had made my way up to the front, climbed through the communion rail, and had firmly fixed myself up at the altar as the priest was getting to the most solemn part of the Mass. No effort on the part of the ushers was going to remove me peacefully, and the priest was wisely signaled to leave me there. Mother soon realized that her Leo was the cause of the commotion at the altar and glanced around disapprovingly as if wondering whose child would do such a thing. I imagine that my father just knelt there pretending that he was part of the family on the other side of him. This early gesture on my part should have been fair warning of what was to become of their Leo. If they had been thinking of their feet, they could have hustled Paul and James out of the church when everybody was going up to the communion and just left me there. We only rented, so they could have packed up and moved before the priests had figured out where to return me to. A missed opportunity for sure, but one can only imagine that being saddled with 3 little boys at their age must have meant many missed opportunities along the way. But 2 years old, I still did not walk. I got by on one-word indications imperiously pointing to what I wanted. That all changed one Sunday afternoon when we were visiting my mother's 2 older sisters and brother, who kept on in the old family home on Essex Street, in East New York section of Brooklyn. We were gathered together in the front parlor, which was only opened and heated on Sundays and high holy days. My father referred to gatherings of mother's family affectionately as the Bund, and the older sister, Madeline, as Der Führer, with the same esteem that most Americans held for Hitler in those years following the war. As they sat around the room and talked, or rather listened to Der Führer, I made my way to the central medallion of the oriental rug in the midst of them, and started twirling around with my arms flayed out like a helicopter. Then Der Führer interrupted her speech, motioned to me with her raised arm, bracelets jangling, and ordered, "Leo, stop that or you will get dizzy." I did 2 more twirls around and stopped, faced her with my hands now on my hips, and issued my first policy statement. Me wanna, me do, me don't, me won't. And returning to my twirling. Silence fell over the room as ice crystals began to form on the rims of the coffee cups they were holding. Was it that I spoke my first sentence, or the unprecedented fact that someone spoke back to Der Führer? Not even my father had dared to do that. I imagine on the way home my father and mother wondered just what they had living under their roof, and mentally counted the days until I'd be 18 and they'd no longer be legally responsible for my actions. In the Garden, 1950 to 1961. Paul and James were as different from me as they were from each other, and we really were like 3 only children, except they managed to interact with each other, doing whatever. I could not care less. Instead of playing cowboys and Indians or some pointless game involving a ball, I was content to be wherever they were not, so I could work on the latest idea that got fixed in my head. I can still remember my mother yelling at the top of her lungs in the direction of the ruckus she was hearing. "Paul! James! Don't make me come up there after you 2!" That would be followed automatically by a shout in the direction of the silence where I was. "Leo, whatever you're doing, clean up the mess you made and come out here so I can keep my eye on you." She never quite understood that the inevitable byproduct of creative genius was debris strewn all over the place. Unlike other little boys, the one thing I loved was going to church, and whenever asked what I wanted to be when I grew up, the reply was always the same: a priest. When I was 3, we moved to a semi-attached house in a place with the quaint name of Floral Park, on the edge of the city. The Polish church, St. Hedwig's, where my parents took us, was only 3 blocks away, and by the time I was 5, I could go there by myself. The neighboring Irish church was too bleak for their German background. I loved High Mass on Sunday with the music, and followed by benediction with all the incense, and also the weekday evening devotions, or just being in the dim-lit church when no one was there but the multitude of colorful life-size statues illuminated by the flickering votive lights. If I had a dime, I could light a candle and say a prayer to Jesus who we knew lived in the golden box in the middle of the altar. I was happy and at home when I was in the church. When he was around 8, Paul had become an altar boy, and so I wanted to be up there in the altar with him. Looking back, I don't really know if he was motivated by some mystical call, or if he had early on figured out that the lighted and decorated sanctuary was a stage for his performance, and he was guaranteed a packed house every Sunday. In any case, he was flawless, his Latin pronunciation better than the priest's, and all the carefully choreographed movements of the Mass were perfectly executed by him. This fascination carried to home as well. We built an altar in the cellar with all the trappings, and Paul would act out the Mass in vestments that we made from old curtains and discarded white starched nurse uniforms. I would dutifully serve him as an altar boy, so I learned all the movements at an early age. One Sunday morning, Paul woke up sick, and finally it was my big chance to take his place as altar boy at church. There was a lingering suspicion that the rat bait that made its way into his supper the evening before had something to do with me, but nothing was ever proven. Except for the Latin responses, I did incredibly well at the altar for a 7-year-old. The priest decided that even at that young age I was ready to be an altar boy, and from there on, I was in my element. James also became an altar boy later on, but most of the masses were in the morning, which was not his best time to shine. And having to go out there dressed in lace-trimmed outfit in front of all those people, especially the nuns in the front row, regularly gave him an upset stomach. But serving at the altar was the center of my young life. Sometimes on Sundays I served not only the High Mass with benediction, but also one of the several low masses that accompanied the 1,000+ faithful that filled our church every Sunday and Holy Day. I loved getting up at dawn on weekday to serve one of the several weekday masses every morning, and especially the 7 a.m. Mass in the chapel of the Sisters' Convent. It was like being allowed to enter an inner sanctum, the Holy of Holies. I was a favorite for being picked to serve at weddings, usually a $2 to $5 tip from the best man, and funerals, 25-cent tip. And going with the priest on the hour-long ride to one of the cemeteries out on Long Island. I was a familiar sight around the parish rectory, and had nothing but reverential awe for the aged Polish rector, Monsignor Kubek. I so idolized the younger Father Walter that I once shaved the front of my hair to imitate his receding hairline. The other assistant priest, Father Michael, used to take all 3 of us for drives on his day off, since he knew our family did not have a car. Sometimes it was to Jones Beach, on Long Island, or to a movie and a meal at Howard Johnson's restaurant. One of the biggest treats was going to Idlewild Airport, now JFK, to see the new space-age terminals and watch the airplanes take off and land. One time, he got us back rather late, and whereas it was no worry to my mother, he got a scolding from Monsignor Kubek the next morning before Mass. I was serving that morning and overheard it, though most of it was in Polish. Fortunately, there was no hint of impropriety in any of our relationships with the parish priests, unlike what we now know is going on elsewhere. The parish priests and the sisters who taught in the school were like my extended family, and I experienced the love of God through them. From kindergarten through 8th grade, I was taught by the Congregation of Sisters of St. Felix, or Felicians, a Franciscan teaching community that originated in 19th century Poland. Even though they were rather strict, on the whole, they were incredibly dedicated and holy women whose lives and caring gave me a lifelong sense of being precious in the eyes of God. It was only later, when I was an adult, that I learned that not everybody had such a positive experience. Sad to say, some remember their Catholic schools as run by a tribe of Celtic warrior dykes, as one dear friend had put it. My fondness for them might have been colored by the fact that these dear sisters thought I and my 2 brothers were little saints. I'm not sure Mother shared that same opinion of us. When she and Father had to go to school for the next annual parent-teacher conference, and they were being told she was so blessed to be the mother of these 3 little saints, I'm sure she fumed, knowing just what 3 little terrors she had to deal with at home. But Mother was steeped well enough in Catholic culture to know that there was a very certain cachet to being the mother of a saint. Sort of being up there with the Blessed Virgin Mary, but not quite. So I passed my childhood with no certain boundary between this world and the next. Home life was not always easy for any of us. There were always financial strains as my parents were too old to cash in on the booming post-war 50s and mentally still lived in the Great Depression. My father's job assignment at the Long Island Railroad became increasingly more demeaning as he was surpassed by younger employees. He had to take evening and overnight shifts eventually, and his health was not always good. Mother had spent most of her young adult life working in an office, and because she was the youngest of 13, she never had to learn much in the way of housekeeping skills. Suddenly she was a housewife and a mother of 3, albeit perfectly well-behaved boys, with overactive imaginations. It must have been very frustrating for her, and I remember one time she lamented out loud that children are supposed to be a blessing, but you 3 are a curse, I tell you. It did not help that I piped up to declare, "Well, why don't you take us to an orphanage where at least the cooking would be better?" It's the only time I remember my mother crying. Domestic harmony was not improved by the fact that in 1953, the Bund abandoned Brooklyn and set up headquarters on Willis Avenue in Floral Park, just 2 blocks away from where we lived. Father likened it to the 1939 invasion of Poland. I remember one visit of the Bund to our house on McKee Street, where we were gathered around the dining room table and Der Fuhrer was speaking and gesturing with her right arm extended when Father, standing behind her chair, took his black comb out of his pocket, held it under his nose, and he mimicked her gestures with his right arm. The image was unmistakable, but we had to pretend that we saw nothing. As soon as we were alone with Mother, we burst our sides in gales of laughter. My brothers and I loved it that we could walk over to Auntie's anytime we liked, and getting invited to Sunday dinner after church was a real upgrade in dining experience. Of course, we all went to the same church, except Father would go to any other Mass than the one that the Bund was attending, which was usually the High Mass. He felt they were ganging up on him. Mother liked it that her family was closer at hand, but not when they came to visit and comment on our housekeeping or lack of it. When little lace chapel veils became a fashionable alternative to the required hat or scarf for women in church, Mother, running late as usual, saw no reason why she could not just grab one of the doilies from the end table next to the living room couch and clip it on her head as she rushed off to catch up to her sisters at Mass. Evident to everyone else, this side of Helen Keller was the perfectly dust-free circle in the center of the doilies where the end of the table lamp had stood since the house had been dusted before last Easter. Nothing was said until they were leaving church, and Der Fuhrer scowled, "Couldn't you have at least grabbed one without a cigarette burning it?" I especially adored Aunt Alice, my godmother, who seemed to come from a different world. She worked in Lower Manhattan, ate in restaurants, went to Broadway shows and the opera. I could take the Long Island Railroad into Brooklyn, change there for the subway to Lower Manhattan, and meet Aunt Alice in her office at 180th Broadway. She would take me shopping for clothes and teach me about quality and style, which she exuded from every pore. Then we'd go to Willie's, a turn-of-the-century German restaurant at William and Fulton Streets, where all the staff knew and loved her. The waitress fussed over me like I was a little prince, and I could order anything I had a mind to as long as I ate everything on my plate. Aunt Alice smoked Pall Malls, yes, in the restaurant, was fond of a cocktail or two, and loved to tell amusing stories and risque jokes from her wilder youth in the 1920s. Every present from her was something special, whether it was the gold cufflinks for my birthday with lions' heads on them, she explained that Leo meant lion in Latin, or the handmade French Easter chocolate, which she got from a little candy shop on Christopher Street in Greenwich Village. She was my window into the larger world out there that I would, early on, be eager to explore. She encouraged me to be myself, and I felt she understood me like no other person on the planet. Aunt Alice and I had one other thing in common. She went early every weekday morning to Mass before she took the train to the office. Aunt Alice was not perfect, and she could certainly hold her own in an argument, but at that age I felt she was a saint, and I never had reason to change my mind about that. My father and mother loved and cared for us as best they could. At his age, now in his mid-50s, Father had little energy left after work to play with us, but on weekends he would read the comics to us from the Sunday papers. If we asked Father how to spell something, he would always reply, "How do you spell it?" Then he would tell us to look it up. That proved to be very useful advice later in life. Other than a Catholic Bible and a set of encyclopedia, bought one volume at a time at the local A&P to help us with our schoolwork, there were no other books evident in the house. This was no great loss for me, since I was not only left-handed, but naturally what we would now call dyslexic. I absorbed better from listening and pictures, as reading left to right was a real effort. As many women were now going out to work, Mother was one of the few on the block still at home, with us as well as half the neighborhood children. She took us on train outings with one or other of our little neighborhood friends. We all had free rail passes because Father worked for the Long Island Railroad. Sometimes we went into Manhattan to go sightseeing, and I can remember us all standing in an office building doorway, eating our sandwiches from home and sharing a quart of milk out of our little plastic cups brought for that purpose. One of our favorite and frequent excursions was to the beach out at Oyster Bay, which was the end of the line for that branch of the train. It was there that I learned to swim in the calm, shallow waters of the Long Island Sound. Television was just beginning to invade the house, and unless it was raining, we played outside after school all summer long. It being what turned out to be the baby boom, there were, at that time, about 60 school-age kids just on our block alone. We were a creative lot, came up with all sorts of games and productions that struck our imaginations. We organized circuses and shows in the vacant lots in the middle of the block, plant sales and bake sales, and of course war games for the boys, in which I wanted to play no part. Mother was very supportive of our projects and went out of her way to accommodate our flights of fancy. Naturally, if there was a wedding in the wind, we had to take place in the miniature cathedral. Naturally, if there was a wedding in the wind that had to take place in the miniature cathedral that had by now taken over our basement, upstairs, the living room and dining room were converted into a banquet hall for the reception, and Mother's kitchen turned out the spread that we mostly put together ourselves. I had by this time assumed the undisputed role of priest and pastor who counseled the young couple about the solemn duties of marriage and parenthood, and then celebrated the nuptial mass with all due solemnity. James was drafted as a groom, since he was easier to convince than the other boys on the block. There being more girls than boys in the mix, I had to go through the complex process of granting James an annulment. Divorce was unheard of in this mostly Catholic neighborhood, so he could be a husband to a different young bride for another wedding. I, of course, never thought of marriage myself. It was out of the question. In fact, I had girls for friends and rarely played with boys my own age, as I thought we had little in common. This did not go unnoticed by some of the adults, but because I was busy bringing religion into the lives of my peers All other oddities could be overlooked. My father and mother did not seem to agree on much, but one thing on which they could both concur was that Leo was, well, different. This was the McCarthy era, and different was not a good thing. It could land you in front of a House Un-American Activities hearing. They did the best they could with me, trying to allay the rising suspicions of family and neighbors. They finally learned to come to terms with the fact that I was irreversibly left-handed and my arty type. My father called me Lefty Leo. One Christmas, they spent an awful lot of money to get me a left-handed pitcher's mitt. I opened the box and pulled out the mitt, held it up and thought, "Now just what am I supposed to do with this?" Then I noticed the box it had been in, and I liked the way it was constructed. So I left the mitt under the Christmas tree and I took the box up to my room, knowing that I could really do something with that box. I grew an interest in both cooking and sewing. I had no interest in cleaning house, and unfortunately neither did anyone else in the family, so shoveling the place out the days before Christmas and Easter was quite a production. My learning to cook was guardedly welcomed, as Mother had no skill or interest in the kitchen matters. The sewing proved to be the most troubling for my parents, but one of my great-grandfathers in Germany was a tailor, so they reassuredly told this to the neighbors as though it was in my genes to sew. Even though I had been given a little hand-cranked sewing machine when I was about 7 years old, "Why are you giving that boy a toy sewing machine?" was heard more than once, and had made new kitchen curtains with it, I eventually saved up enough money from my paper route to buy a used electric sewing machine at Washington's birthday sale, and Mother gave up finally and let me keep it. Father said his usual, "Oh no," and wore that perpetual look of exacerbation on his face. The fuss died down when, while I was still in grade school, I started to turn out new curtains and drapes for all over the house. A few new slipcovers and even tailored clothes for my mother, who was hard to fit because of a childhood illness. But I had another goal in mind. Ever since childhood, I had an intense interest with the vestments that the priests wore for the church services I so loved. My most treasured toy was a hand-me-down Steve teddy bear, which had movable head, arms, and legs. In one of my secret solo projects, I had fashioned a complete set of mass vestments for Father Teddy, using scraps of cloth and paper, with the embroidered details all drawn out with colored crayons. From there I moved on to the Infant of Prague, a very popular devotional image of the boy Jesus dressed as a little king with royal vestments that were changed according to the liturgical colors of the church year. When I was about 7, Aunt Madeline, der Führer, gave me a little Infant of Prague figure that she had made in ceramic class. This was the 50s, and even though she was the seamstress in the family, she would not teach me, a little boy, to sew, any more than she would have taken me downtown and signed me up to the Communist Party. But she would let me watch her and even take home some scraps of silk, gold braid, and lace to trim so I could fit my infant with a set of vestments. I continued improving my skills, analyzing things to see how they were made until I talked Mother into letting me get a 2-foot plaster infant with a real gold-plated removable crown. Now I had my electric sewing machine, and I had also discovered the myriad of church supply shops clustered around Barclay Street near Aunt Alice's office. There I could purchase scraps of authentic ecclesiastical fabric and trimmings so that I could fashion an array of elaborate vestments for my infant. From there it was only a small step to making up my mind that I could make real vestments for our parish church. Me wanna, me do, me don't, me won't. I told one of the priests what I wanted to do, and I asked for an old set of vestments to take home and pattern. My first big project was a lightweight full set of white and gold vestments that would be worn for the annual and often sweltering Corpus Christi celebration, consisting of chasuble, dalmatic, tunicle, cope, and humeral veil, along with the necessary stoles and maniples, burse, and chalice veil. I was 13 and just finishing 8th grade when I did that. But I in no way came across as a sissy boy. as I was just as competent with a hammer and a saw as I was with a needle and thread. When I was about 11 years old, the local paint store had a sidewalk sale of odds and ends and wallpaper for a penny a roll. I got into my mind that I would go to the bedroom that James and I shared with this knotty pine patterned wallpaper. Father said, "Oh no, you could never do that by yourself." I said nothing, just waited until he went off to work, and by the time he came home, the room was done. Within a year, I had repapered and repainted just about every room in the house with bargain wallpaper. Otherwise, I was an average student, but had been what they called a sickly child, and I missed quite a lot of school time. I was smart enough to catch up lost time and get decent enough grades. What exactly was wrong with me, I never really knew, as doctors then did not even tell adults that they were dying of cancer, let alone discuss things with a child. There were doctor's visits and tests, but nothing was said. I found out that my parents had taken out a $1,000 life insurance policy on me, but not my brother's, when I was 9 years old, enough to pay the funeral costs. In the later years of grade school, I did make friends with a few boys in my class, but I knew, and they knew, that I was not like them. Nevertheless, they liked me because I was unabashedly myself, and in an old way, they were in awe of me. In an odd way, they were in awe of me. In a cloud of innocence and determination, I graduated from St. Hedwig's School and the sheltering familiarity of the good sisters and priests that had so shaped me in the knowledge of a loving God. There are 3 tangible practices that took root in my spiritual life from these early days of religious formation that have remained with me throughout my whole life to this very day. The primary practice was the experience of the presence of Christ in the Holy Eucharist, both in the celebration of Mass culminating in the intimate experience of physical communion with the divine, love, and the extension of that experience in adoration of the Eucharistic presence enthroned on the altar. The other devotion that has remained with me is veneration of Mary and the Mother of Jesus, especially as imaged in the world-renowned icon of Mary and the Christ child, popularly known under the title of Our Mary of Perpetual Help. This image of maternal love provided a feminine element to my appreciation of being a beloved child of the divine being in whom we all live and move and have our being. The third formative ethos was a love of St. Francis of Assisi, as he was exemplified by the Franciscan sisters who taught me. The image of the brown hooded woolen robe tied at the waist with a thrice-knotted cord, bearded chin, and sandal-shod feet early on seemed like a look that suited me well. Around this time I took to wearing sandals, and on one occasion I went with my aunts on a drive out to Long Island, but they refused to take me into the restaurant with them, as they were sure my sandals would be mistaken more for identification with the emerging hippie movement than with St. Francis. My path from there seemed pretty clear and straightforward. I'm going to pause for a moment.